Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Hi everyone, my name is Morgan, and I am here with some really cool scientists and engineers to talk about what it's like to work in the space industry. So I'm going to start off by turning it over to my friends, Claire, Ellen, and Mandy, to introduce themselves and tell us about all of the cool space stuff they do. So we'll start with you, Claire.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Claire Leon, and I started my career at Hughes Aircraft after getting a degree in mechanical engineering. But let me tell you, when I got a degree in mechanical engineering, I really had no idea what an engineer did. But I started at Hughes. They invited me to work in the propulsion department, and I just thought it was going to be really cool to work in the space industry. So when let's go to the next chart. I ended up working on satellites. And so you see me in the picture on the left, the girl with the long red hair. I was about 26 years old. Behind the group of people is a UHF satellite. So it's a communication satellite for the Navy. And that's kind of what the satellite looked like in space. However, this satellite actually launched on the shuttle, and it launched in what we called a stowed configuration. So the antennas that are up and out in the picture on the left are pushed down and in so that the satellite could take up as little room in the shuttle as possible. And that's a very common technique that's used when we launch satellites. Is on the ground, we make them as small as we can. And then when we push them out into space, then they have antennas that deploy and solar panels that deploy, and they take up a whole lot more room. But I really loved working in the space industry. Then one of my next programs that I worked, if you go to the next chart, was PanAmSat, where instead of being a test engineer on the floor actually testing satellites, I became the systems engineering manager for the satellites. So you see on the left, you see us in the high bay, which is where we built satellites, and I was with the customer and my boss and one of the other engineers on the program, and you see the satellites rolled over. So one of the things you find is that satellites are kind of, they actually have been getting bigger and bigger, and you need a lot of special equipment to build them in the factory. And then on the right, you see we've turned the satellite right side up, but this picture actually is in a high bay in French Guiana. So we launched on a rocket built by Arianespace called the Ariane. And anyway, a whole team of us went to South America to launch the satellite. So that was fun because you never know where you're going to get to travel when you work in the space industry. And then the next satellite I worked on a little bit later in my career. It's on the next page. And this is called Wideband Global Satcom. And this was a very, very advanced at the time communication satellite for the Air Force. And so, and it launched on an Atlas rocket from Florida. So those are just a few highlights of my career. But anyway, I loved working on things that went into space. I thought it was about the coolest thing that you could ever do. So my degree in mechanical engineering got me started, and then I continued to learn throughout my career. Back to you, Morgan.
Yep, and we'll turn it over to Ellen to talk about her career.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Ellen Stofan, and I am a planetary geologist, and currently I run the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. If I can have the first slide. So I wanted to show this slide because I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. That's my sister, and my dad was an engineer, and unfortunately my dad cut our hair, so the unfortunate haircuts go completely to my dad. But even more importantly, my dad was actually a rocket engineer. He worked, started out at NASA before it was even called NASA, when it was called the NACA. And he actually helped design the propulsion systems for the very first rockets that NASA used to launch. So I went to my first rocket launch when I was 4 years old. It actually blew up on the launch pad, which is maybe why I never wanted to be an astronaut. It was uncrewed, so no one got hurt. But over my time growing up, NASA was just part of my life. But you know, I never really thought about working at NASA. I knew I wanted to be a scientist. I loved picking up rocks. And then I found out geology was a career where they actually paid you for picking up rocks. but I really got interested in eventually in how to combine this love I had for NASA, which had been such a part of my life, with my love of science. If I can have the next slide. So I actually went on to become what's called a volcanologist. So I study volcanoes around the world. And this is a photo of me doing some work in Hawaii on a volcano. But I not only work on volcanoes here on Earth, I also study volcanoes on Venus, Mars, and one of the moons of Saturn called Titan. So I went into planetary geology, and I got interested in that because my dad was actually in charge of the rocket that was launching the first 2 NASA landers to Mars, the Viking landers. And I got to go to a talk by all these scientists on the mission, and they were talking about how we were looking for life on Mars and learning more about how the Earth formed by studying Mars. And I thought, well, that's pretty cool. So I think I want to do that. So next slide. So while I was in college, one of the things that I did is I interned at the National Air and Space Museum, because we have a group called the Center for Earth and Planetary Studies, where I actually got to do some maps of the Earth using satellite data, and I got to do all kinds of fun things. But I have to tell you, this was after my freshman year in college. I never really ever thought I'd get to the point I am now. Next slide. I worked at NASA. I was the chief scientist of NASA. I worked on a lot of NASA missions, but for the last 3 years, I've been the head of the Air and Space Museum, and it's been really fun, especially last summer when we spent a lot of time celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Apollo missions. And I get to do cool things like hang out with Jim Lovell, who some of you might know who he is from the movie Apollo 13. Tom Hanks played Jim Lovell in that movie. But just really fun to be able to talk to and really celebrate all the great things that this country has done in space. So that's a brief history. Morgan?
Great, thank you. We'll go to Mandy now.
Sure, thanks everybody. So I had always been interested in space from as a kid, watching the space shuttle. So watching the space shuttle launch, and I liked airplanes, and actually took my first flying lesson when I was 11 years old. I flew a little Cessna 152 with an instructor and had a great time. But my parents told me, I grew up in Texas, they told me, you're not allowed to learn how to fly a plane until you can drive yourself to the airport. Okay, so I just filed that away. And then when I was 16, it's like, well, can I learn how to fly airplanes now? So my parents relented. And so I had been a recreational pilot since I was 18 and just always loved airplanes, and wanted to be a pilot and an astronaut. And I went to college. I went to MIT in Massachusetts, which was just awesome, just to be around all these other people that had my same passion and interest in airplanes and space. And it was really just then kind of finding other people a lot like me that had the same wishes and dreams. So then I was in the Air Force. I was actually an engineer for the United States Air Force. And I worked on some tests. I helped test rocket engines for a couple of years, where we actually would put these small rocket engines into chambers and then bring the pressure down so it would simulate like it's in space. And then you'd fire these rocket engines off, and it was really cool. So we went through this a few times. And then I went and worked on a couple of fun satellite programs. One of them is called the Space-Based Space Surveillance System. And this is nothing as big as what Claire just showed in her pictures, but a good sized satellite that is flying around in orbit, and its whole job, it has a telescope on it that swivels around and it looks at other objects in space. So it's basically collecting all this information on where is everything else in space. So as other satellites are going up and orbiting around, we know where they are, we know where things are moving. So it's kind of like air traffic control for airplanes in space. So super fun to think about, wow, there's so much going on up there. How can we learn how to move things around? How do we keep everybody safe? And I've always loved rockets and airplanes. And now I'm here with Vox Space. And a lot of what we do is about launching satellites into space. And our rocket's a little different. We're actually launching the rocket from the wing of a 747. So very, very different. It's a cool system where we've got this big airplane with this rocket hanging on the wing. We fly that up over the ocean, drop the rocket off, and it launches new satellites into space. So super, super fun.
Well, it sounds like you guys have all had really cool jobs in space. So thank you for sharing that with us. I know we've got a lot of questions from kids around the country. So we're going to go to those questions next, and we'll ask everyone to answer the questions. So we're going to start off with Sophie from California.
Hi, I'm Sophie Dumit from Culver City High School in California, and I'd like to thank the Center for Strategic and International Studies for this opportunity. So regarding the space environment and missions to the moon and Mars that we're hearing so much about today, my question is, why don't satellites and electronics freeze in space? Are there many different ways for keeping them from freezing? Is overheating ever an issue? How are we solving this problem today, and is anybody working on new ways to solve it? Thank you.
So to answer Sophie's question, we'll go to Claire first.
Okay, so that is a very interesting and sophisticated question. Thermal control is one of the key concerns for launching anything into space, whether it's the International Space Station or a satellite or a rocket. And absolutely, engineers spend many, many hours trying to figure that out. And it's done with certain materials. And so one of the things that we do is actually cover certain areas of a satellite or the space station with blankets. We actually have thermal control devices, to control the temperature. Anyway, there's many techniques, but it is one of the major concerns. Things absolutely do burn up in space or get too hot, because on Earth we have air and convection and things cool kind of naturally, and in space there's no air. And so even at a small device level, you mount a device on a metal housing of some sort, and if it's not properly mounted, it can just burn up, as you said. So anyway, everything is analyzed, everything is mounted very carefully, and it is one of the biggest concerns that we have when we design satellites or space stations or just about anything that goes into space.
Thanks. We'll go to Ellen next.
Yeah, it's really complicated depending on what you're trying to do. So some things like telescopes that are looking super deep into the universe, when they're out in space, the electronics and the instruments have to be kept really cold. And so you actually have to send coolers to keep them cold, because when the sun is shining directly on them, they can overheat. And so in some cases, even though when you're out of the direct path of the sun in space, it can get extremely cold, sometimes you want your instruments cold. The other thing is sometimes you go places where the temperatures are extreme. Like I've worked on missions to Venus where it's 500 degrees centigrade or 900 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface. And in that case, you're trying to insulate the electronics so they don't burn up from the heat from outside. In the early days of Venus exploration, the Russians actually really insulated the spacecraft so well that the instruments, the electronics actually overheated inside before the heat from outside killed them. So it was a race between which was going to happen first. It lasted for about an hour and a half on the surface.
Great, we'll go to Mandy next.
Sure, great question. But no, space is tough, right? Because you're going from super extreme hot to super extreme cold and back and back and back. So then, as Claire said, that's one of the things we're constantly evaluating and modeling. Okay, if you've got this chip next to this device, next to this panel, how does the heat transfer through and how does it come back? How do the materials expand or contract as they get hard? From my job, where we're actually then trying to put this satellite onto the launch vehicle, how do we help make sure that everything stays snug and tight and where it should be so we don't mess any of those connections up is super important. And in terms of what are some new things coming to help work with this, it's some fascinating research, like really in the materials and things in heat transfer. Can you have even just can you make a structural panel, not just a piece of structure, but also a way to help regulate heat and pull heat away from hot components? And it's even down to the molecular level, some of these levels of analysis. And it is something that through the life of a space program, we're making these really cool models and looking at this and trying to understand this over and over and over again as we learn what this thing is going to do, much less live in space or on Venus, as Ellen said. So great question, really cool technologies to help monitor and solve it. And I think even cooler technologies to help model it.
All right, now we have a question from Malis in Kentucky.
Hi, I'm Melis from Kentucky, and my question to the panel is, what is the most interesting thing about space to you?
We'll start with Ellen.
Well, as a scientist, the really fascinating thing about space right now is this search for life beyond Earth. You know, we're now discovering thousands of planets around other stars. We're looking for Earth 2.0. Can we find a potentially habitable or even inhabited planet beyond Earth? And we're really targeting a few worlds in our own solar system: Mars, Europa, which is one of the moons of Saturn, Enceladus and Titan, which are moons of, they're moons of Saturn. Europa's at Jupiter. Really trying to figure out, could life have evolved somewhere else beyond Earth? How different is it that life that evolved here on Earth? And the exciting thing is we're going to be answering these questions in the next 10 to 20 years, especially in our own solar system, and getting really good data on planets around other stars. So it's sort of this really exciting point of answering a question that humans have wondered about, I think, ever since we could look up into the night sky and wonder, are we alone?
We'll go to Mandy next.
I think, to me, the most interesting thing about space is two things. First, it's cooperation. People cooperate in space in ways that you very rarely see on Earth. Like one really cool example is the space station. So we've got the International Space Station up there now, where I think there's 20 countries that have different elements involved with the space station, and they helped build it together, and we maintain it together, and we fly astronauts up there from different countries and from different nations. And it's a way to really enable that we are all on Earth as a team here together, and to be able to say, okay, teamwork isn't just because I'm here working with you, but it really is to say, hey, space impacts all of us, and we can work together to go explore it.
Great, we'll go to Claire next.
Yeah, so building on what Mandy was talking about of cooperation, even just design something to go into space, there has to be a lot of cooperation. And so to me, one of the fascinating things as somebody who does help design and build satellites is there's structure, there's harness, there's thermal, there's communications, there's electromagnetic interference, there's, I don't know, 15 different disciplines, and everything has to work. Everything has to be analyzed. And I think that makes it kind of fascinating. And so it's, but it's, again, that's that cooperation, but it's also technology and really understanding how the world works, and then doing the analysis and developing that deep understanding. So it's not like you just design something and launch it into space. You can, probably isn't going to work very long, but when you do a robust job and you get all these different disciplines working together, and you prove the design and you test it and you operate it like it's going to operate in space, then when you launch it, you can have confidence it's actually going to work. But it is that huge team effort to make it happen. And to me, that was kind of what made it fun.
Great, we're going to take a question now from John, who is from Virginia.
Hi, my name is John, and I am a 13-year-old from Albany, Virginia, and I have a question to ask you. Is it a requirement for long-term space travel to create artificial gravity to address human physiological constraints, and is it being developed? Thank you.
That is a great question from John. We'll turn to Ellen first.
Sure. You know, if you watch a lot of science fiction movies, you'll see that the spaceships on their way out into the solar system will rotate, and that's how you create artificial gravity for spacecraft. You know, right now, especially for those first missions to Mars, NASA's not really planning on creating artificial gravity because by studying humans for the last 20 years on the International Space Station, we've figured out ways to keep humans in space for long periods of time. They have to exercise a lot, they have to eat right, and so we don't see the need for it. But if humans want to go much further, or much more frequently, we're going to need artificial gravity eventually. So I think it'll come, but the first missions to Mars, we're going to be in microgravity like we are on the International Space Station. But again, we've learned ways to mitigate those effects.
All right, we'll go to Claire next.
So one of the things that I've been doing in my time at Loyola Marymount is trying to invent courses that get people inspired about space. And so I've taught a class called Occupy Mars at a graduate level, and then Becoming a Multiplanetary Species for freshmen. And my career was really on the spacecraft side, not on the manned space, human space flight. So I've had to learn a tremendous amount about, okay, what does it really take to get humans to these far out places? And so I don't think we're going to see the sci-fi, Ellen was talking about, the science fiction where the whole station is rotating. But there are techniques where you could create a system where you put somebody on a turntable of sorts and you spin them very fast, almost like a centrifuge, and you can then stress the body. But to build on your question of why does it matter? It's because in that microgravity, bones break down, they become very porous, sort of like old people. So you end up with osteoporosis. So by creating this centrifuge-like thing, even exposing somebody to it for an hour a day in space could really help re-strengthen the bones and then prevent that bone deterioration. But there definitely is experimentation going on with this whole field right now. Or has over the decades, but I don't think we're actually building something yet. But as Ellen said, if we're going to be there in space for a long time, we're going to have to figure these things out. But it might not be the sci-fi answer, it might be something intermediate.
All right, we'll go to Mandy next.
Sure, I'll keep it really short and sweet since I'm not the doctor or working on interplanetary missions, but I'm launching the rocket, so I'm imparting G's on people. But one thing that's really kind of fun in terms of how can you do this research in terms of what is the impact of gravity on the human body. I mean, Ellen's exactly right. We've had people on the space station for 20 years, for some cases a really long time. So we've been able to collect great data. And then also in terms of how can you treat those conditions, or how can you build things and take advantage of that microgravity? What does that do to how do you work in space? Here on Earth, there's things that you can do where you can, NASA has this really cool airplane, the KC-135 Vomit Comet, as they call it, where they can fly in a parabolic motion so they can impart zero gravity onto people and equipment in the airplane, and even experiment even in short 30-second bursts on what does zero G feel like, how do you work in it, how can we design tools that work, how do we make experiments that can be operated in zero G work. So there's just some really cool ways that you can experiment to learn how to live in zero G even before you go to the space station or on your way to Mars.
Awesome, those are great answers. We have one more question from Estelle from California.
Grandma, how can I be an astronaut to go up into outer space?
We'll send that to Claire first.
Thanks. Well, Estelle, to be an astronaut, you have to learn a lot about space. And so reading books about the planets and space technology is good, learning about science, but mostly just being interested and learning every day will pave the way to you becoming an astronaut.
We'll go to Mandy next.
Absolutely. So Estelle, I think the best way to try to become an astronaut is to study, learn, just as Claire said, go to school and do your homework, and whatever you want to study, whether it's math or science, all of those are paths to being an astronaut. So let's go to school and make sure we do our homework.
We'll go to Ellen next.
Estelle, your grandma got it just right. You know, you just have to really study and understand lots of things about the world around us, about space. And I think if you look at astronauts today, they come from all kinds of different backgrounds. Some of them have been in the military, some of them have been doctors, some of them are scientists. So it really matters the most that you love what you do and you are in some field that is related to space in some way, but you're going to find that passion.
All right, everybody. So we have gotten some great answers to really interesting questions about space today. But that last question, I think, teed it up. I think everyone needs to go back and study now. So thanks for tuning in. And we hope you you keep your interest up in space and consider studying science, engineering, math, or any of those other fields that are related to space.